Hi, Keith. Thank you
Hi.
so much for taking the time out to have a conversation. We're going to be talking about leading through the pandemic, and I've been sort of somewhat awash with certainly clinicians who are both really stressed out with the current, but also really thinking ahead to the future. So a lot of our folk who've been involved in our leadership programs really understand the work you've been doing around adaptive leadership and crisis. And I suppose the biggest issue is, whilst people have a probably a bit more handle on crisis, they're really worried about the adaptive challenge and how do we move into a longer term relationship, new ways of innovating, different ways of working. So that's the context for this series of leading through the pandemic. But Keith, perhaps you could just introduce yourself first.
Yep, so Keith Grint, I'm Emeritus Professor at Warwick Business School, used to be Professor of Public Leadership until last year.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks for joining us. And I know you've contributed on pretty much every program we've run around this. So I'm going to start off, Keith, with just getting a grip on this relationship between tame, wicked, and crisis problems. And I'm just going to draw up your slide here to illustrate this. So what really struck me is that I suppose we're all starting to think about was this inevitably going to be a crisis, or could it have been an adaptive challenge? Could we have kept it in that adaptive space?
That's always difficult to say in advance. I think retrospectively, probably not, given the novelty of the virus. I think if it was something like Ebola, which we faced before, or some places have faced before, and we have a mechanism, a standard procedure for controlling it, then we might have been able to control it in the same way. But since it's an innovative, novel virus and nobody really knew how to control it or what it was, I think it always started out as a wicked problem and then transformed into all kinds of other things as we went along with it. So I don't know that there's ever been a time when we knew what to do and all we had to do was lay out the processes to manage it. I don't think it was ever like that.
And so we are where we are now in this crisis management model, be it from Excel and trying to get people who can do task-based work to do it very, very well. So we're absolutely in that command and control mechanism now. And our leaders, I suppose, have got used to a level of managing complexity. So they're used to managing a performance management system, but they're also, I think, getting used to working in a collaborative and adaptive system. But this requires, I'm guessing, in your view, pretty much a command and control response.
Yeah, so I mean, it starts out as a wicked problem. Nobody is quite sure what to do. And then I think what happens originally is that the Chinese try to manage it on the assumption that the processes they've got will hold it at bay, and that proves not to be the case. And then it turns into a critical problem. And the model implies that for those kinds of problems, you need command. And of course, the Chinese society is set up for command, not just the economy, but society as well. So they were able in many ways to control what was going on, to shut down huge provinces quite quickly and quite effectively. And I think that command problem has always faced more liberal economies, more liberal societies, such as in the West. So when it first appears in the UK, for example, and I think the assumption is, are you still there? Yeah. 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 I think the assumption, first of all, is that we will be able to manage this. And I think the Prime Minister, etc., and Trump in the same position in the US, both go on TV and say, there's no need to panic, we can control this, we can do this, it'll be fine. And then it rapidly becomes clear that it isn't going to be fine, and we don't have the processes to control it, and we don't have the resources to control it. So then it turns into a critical problem. And then the question is, are we able to command acquiescence amongst the community? And I think certainly in the short run you can, and certainly if people believe what they're hearing on the television and the radio, then you can command them. But the problem is always both temporal. Can you command them for a long term? So it's all right doing it for a couple of weeks, but when we're 3 months down the line and we're still doing this, can we still do this? And then secondly, the command mode really runs very contrary to the way that liberal economies operate. So you can shut down the economy to make the place a bit safer, but at some point you can't. At some point you have to relax the rules on the economy. So then the choice is, do you relax the rules on the economy and put the population under threat, as Trump appears to be doing, and as Johnson was appearing to do at one point in time, or do you just stick with the command mode? And can you actually do the command mode? Well, I think a lot of the time, many of our political leaders might think they operate in a command mode, but I'm not sure that they have the resources to do that, which is really about being very consistent, very decisive. And the latter word is a really important word, because I think, as we've seen in certainly in America, Trump is decisive, but quite often decisively wrong. So he makes a decision which appears to be in the wrong direction, and then almost instantly changes his direction. So he's operating in the command mode as a commander. So, quote, we will shut down New York, or we will isolate New York. And then the following day says, well, we're not going to shut down New York. So that dilly-dallying in the command mode is really dangerous, because then people begin to lose confidence in their commander. And that's when the problems occur. So it's all very well to be able to recognize that the problem is now a critical problem and requires command, but it's much more difficult to be able to command it when you're operating in a liberal economy, and when you're as idiosyncratic as both the Prime Minister and the President actually are. So,
Keith, what about in a I suppose less idiosyncratic mode, which is back in our NHS organisations, which is some ways set up for a very bureaucratic organisation, rather than a command organisation. So we're seeing a mixture here, I think, of command from the top, against modelling some of the politicians, which gets changed, and a sort of localism swell, both within communities, but also within the primary care networks, who are beginning to forge their own power bases. So that you can see this bit of a tension about, do we just take charge of our own future? What does that look like? How much authority have we got? Do we have people behind us? Who is the person that does command at a local level?
No, I thought this. So lots of the command at the political level is primarily rhetorical. It doesn't actually do very much. The fact that the Prime Minister says you can't go out of your house doesn't stop you from going out of your house, and there aren't enough police officers to stop you anyway. So there is something in here about the kind of relationship between so-called soft power and hard power. That hard power, ironically, is dependent upon soft power. If people don't want to comply with you, then you can't force them to comply. And if you're going to fine me £80 or £1,000 for going out in the day, and I'm very rich, then I can do whatever I like. So there's something in here about the way that what local authorities and what local trusts have discovered, really, is that the command mode only goes so far. And the command mode is rooted in the assumption that if you're in control, then presumably you have the resources to be able to do what you've said we need to be done. But if you don't have the resources, then your authority is undermined by the fact that you can't control it, you can't command us. And I think at that point, what you get and what you've seen is a large, as you say, a kind of groundswell and mobilization of local communities, because they've recognized that you can't rely upon this hard power command from the top, either from local or central governments, to be able to do the things that need doing. And I think that runs into an issue about the status of the model. It seems to imply sometimes that you've got three very separate kinds of problems. I don't think you ever have those kinds of separations. What you quite often have is a problem that goes across all three of those, and it shifts, and it depends on who you are and where you're sitting, what kind of problem you're looking at. So this comes into an issue about, so what will happen when it's all finished, on the assumption that it's all finished. I think there's a big opportunity here for the health service to be able to rethink and reconfigure itself in different kinds of ways, to shift away from the over bureaucratic mode and to shift towards a much more localized, community-based approach, which is about people taking responsibility and basically learning how to lead. And I think so often when we have very bureaucratic organizations, and the NHS is one, what you do is you disempower people. You don't teach them how to lead. And then when things go wrong, somebody has to step up to the plate. And that's when we develop this kind of community mode. But it's not the best way to do it. But I think it's an opportunity when it's done, is to be able to say, look, we did pretty well. We survived X and Y, but we got these things wrong. And the way to do it next time is not to be so reliant upon the centre. If the centre can't provide those resources, and then we have to be able to provide them. We have to do it ourselves.
So is that more in your egalitarianism model, Keith?
Yeah, so I think the egalitarian bit is really kind of understanding of the limits of the hierarchy, which isn't to say that you don't need hierarchy. You will still need the hierarchy. You still need the resources from the top. But I think it's a recognition that the top can't do it all. The top doesn't have the resources or the knowledge or the information to be able to do all of this in such a large scale organization. You have to be able to decentralize. And the best way to do that, under some circumstances, is to develop a much more egalitarian model. But again, it's not just egalitarian. So it seems to sit, you need to have the egalitarian model within the hierarchy. And these two appear to be in tension, but actually they can work together. This is the so-called clumsy bit. They appear to be in tension, but they're not. Yes. So the brick-and-learn model is, well, this isn't working. Let's just try something different and see whether it works. And recognizing that this might not work either. But at least we're going to try it, and then we'll learn from the mistakes, and then we'll develop something which will be able to cope better with the situation as we see it in front of us.
What about this? So one of the things that I think I took from your work, which I think was really helpful and seems to be emerging actually even in the popular press, is the notion of reframing. Churchill taking time out to reframe during the war. The real importance of leaders to take that time to see the problem from a distance and then step back into it.
Yeah, so I mean, the reframing thing is not just for political leaders, of course. It's for all of us to sit back and reframe and think about this, because quite often we're so busy individually and personally that we don't take time to stop and think, why am I doing all this stuff all the time? When actually the really important things and the really difficult things are the things that I'm avoiding doing because I'm making myself so busy. So I think a lot of people will emerge out of this with a different understanding of what life is all about and what society is all about and what our health system should be all about, and its connection, of course, to social services and social care. Because I think a lot of, at the moment, a lot of the support is for the health service. But you don't get a lot of support for the other services.
Yeah, social care.
So exactly. Social care is a real downer on here. And there's something in here about, this is a system. It's not just one bit. There's no point in being, thank you for all the nurses, if you don't have people to look after the old people in homes. So there's something in here about recognizing the integration of the system. And you can see how that integration works when the government says, here's a list of important people. And then by the day that multiplies tenfold because they've suddenly realized there are so many important jobs to fulfill because we're so integrated.
And so many people that need apparently sheltering in their own homes, also in the tens of thousands. So when we're thinking about our I'm listening to health leaders who have a range of responses to uncertainty. Of course they do. And for some, it's almost taking them back into old habits, and they're almost unable to think outside of the box or to move out of the sort of stress of the current situation. And maybe that'll ameliorate over time as they get into their own patterns and rhythms. Others who are busy doing surveys of their staff and trying to work out what's going on in A&E because it's so quiet, and isn't it marvelous? And how do we help make that stick? We've got a huge range of responses, but one thing's for sure, that whenever you're doing these types of problems, you need some level of sort of after action review, even in the middle of it, some point at which you stop and you say, what is going on here? What have we done? What do we think works and how do we know? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I do. And I think, it goes back to the kind of window of opportunity which will exist in a very short time of frame when this is over. And it's a bit like, during the Second World War, what Beveridge did is basically ask questions along with a lot of other people. What are we fighting for? What is the purpose of this? And if the purpose is just to defeat the enemy or the virus, then we can probably do that. But is that the purpose? Or is the purpose to set a system up which is much more robust, that doesn't fall over when we get something like this again? Because we will get something like this again. So the question is, can we build a system which is more robust? And that kind of runs into a question about, what is the purpose of the NHS? What are we here for? Are we here to provide infinite care at infinite cost for everybody forever? Or are we here to provide a different kind of service? And if you look, I mean, I don't know about this, but somebody was in the paper yesterday talking about the proportion of people in high care facilities with a virus. Only about 50% of them survive. Now, whether that's true or not, let's just assume it's true for the sake of the argument. That implies that a huge resource is being spent in very intensive care for a small number of people. Should we be putting that resource there, or should we be saying what we should be doing is putting that resource into testing or something else, or preventative care, or care for the people that have just started to show symptoms, rather than for those that we know half of them are going to die anyway? And that's a really tough question. But if you don't ask the question, we end up doing what we always do in the health service, which is looking at the kind of emergency care and the really complicated and complex surgery that might be interesting for the surgeons, but it may not be the best use of resource that we've got.
I suppose one of the patterns that could re-emerge that actually probably isn't helpful is heroic leadership. So I was looking at the level of personal protective equipment that people have got.
Yeah.
In the pandemics around the world, the Ebola crisis, the doctors are saying you must not put yourself at risk, because if you put yourself at risk and you die, then the implications is that you therefore can't treat other people. And so you have to personally make some very difficult decisions about, are you ready? Are you equipped and safe in going in to look after people? And I think some of those, but the heroic model means people desperately want to step in, and the empathetic model, people want to help. That's what the NHS does. We give of ourselves to help other people have better lives. And I think the judgment call around that is being incredibly difficult, morally and ethically very difficult for clinicians. But it does start bringing up some of these really deep questions about at what price, for what, for who. And I guess at the moment, that's framed because we don't really understand the virus. So we don't know what choices we're really making. So at the moment, people are, I think, legitimately making some decisions that are maybe not public, but are ethically and morally robust. But as we understand it more, the understanding will give us clearer choices, and those are going to be hard to make.
Yeah, I mean, there is something about the heroic model which I think is deeply dangerous in some ways. So the best example of the kind of counterproductive nature of heroic leadership might be Ibsen's Enemy of the People novel, the play. And there is something in there. And if people don't know the play, it's about a Norwegian tourist town. They spent a lot of money on the public baths. The public baths are about to open, and the local doctor, Dr. Stockman, realizes the baths are poisoned and tries to close them. After speaking to his brother, the mayor won't have any of it because they spent so much money and the season is about to start. So he refuses. And then Stockman says, well, I'll call a public meeting, and people will obviously take the responsible pattern of behavior. So he's being a hero, but the people howl him down and call him the enemy of the people. So there's something in there about trying to recognize that heroism is quite often not linked to any kind of populist or popular approach. Sometimes you have to be heroic in a quite different way. This is the notion of giving wicked problems back to the people that have got the problem rather than solving it for them. And when you compare that to what the Prime Minister Johnson has gone on record and talked about the mayor in Jaws, which Jaws of course is framed around Enemy of the People. It's the same framework. So you've got the beginning of the tourist season and Jaws is eating somebody. And the local mayor says that no, the beaches will stay open. And Boris Johnson has quoted him as saying, this is the kind of leader I want to be. So the notion that you put the economy in front of public health in the case of Jaws. And I think it's the same now. And Trump exactly falls into that notion that Mayor Vaughan says the economy is more important than the health of the population. And it's a really difficult decision to make, and sometimes it's very obvious the decision you ought to be making. At this point, it's not to open the economy up again. And Trump has talked about this in terms of Easter, but now he's changed his mind again. So that's an issue. But I mean, the more important point is to go back to the notion of heroism and think about, is the heroic mode actually productive or counterproductive? Because if you end up putting yourself out of action or dying, you're of no use to anybody. So that's heroic in a very counterproductive way. And we have to be quite tough and say, if I put myself at risk, I can't help anybody. So I'm not going to put myself at risk. And I think what happens is the kind of crisis mode generates this notion that we should all throw ourselves into the problem rather than stepping back and thinking, just a second, if we all go in and we all get it, there isn't any health service, let's just think about this. And if this means some difficult decisions to be made, then they need to be made.
So we've got, I mean, I think there's something to be done, to be said, therefore, to support our leaders in the legitimate role of stepping back, the legitimate role of being in listening and observing space, because the desperate desire to do could be overwhelming. So perhaps we could just finish with some top tips for our senior clinical leaders, maybe, and our senior managerial leaders in the health service. What would you say to them about how do you keep your focus over the next year so that we have a sustainable and better solution, and don't get sort of gripped by the fear and the anxiety of the current?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. I think a lot of this is just individual rather than actually collective. I mean, my own response is to think about this is just one of many issues that have faced humanity across time. I mean, every generation faces something equally difficult and quite often worse than what we're looking at. So it's about recognizing that this is not entirely novel. It's not the end of the world, but if we treat it and learn from it as we're going along, then we can avoid making too many mistakes. And that requires people in the health service to keep going rather than either give up or throw themselves in and burn themselves up. I remember years ago talking to a social worker who was about to give up because he was burnt out. He was about 35 and had been on the front line for 10 years. And he told me a story about, he was talking to an at-risk child who was about 10, who found himself. He just talked to him and he said, so what's your first memory, son? And the boy said, very dark, being thrown about and a police siren. And the social worker said, where does that memory come from? He said, oh, I don't remember it really, but my mum was a crack addict. And when the police came in the front door looking for the drugs, she grabbed me, threw me in the boot of her car, drove off at high speed with the police chasing her, who didn't know I was in the boot of the car. So my first memory is being thrown about in the boot of a car with the police siren. And that's all I don't know why it happened, but that's what I remember. And the social worker said, when he listened to the boy, he suddenly thought, well, I can't save the entire world, but I can save you, son. And that's what I'm going to do. And it's that recognition that you don't have to save the entire world. You have to be able to save enough people. And that means looking after yourself first and foremost, because if you can't do it, then you can't do anything. Yeah.
So thank you, Keith. I think that my takeaways from that are, it's not compartmentalized. You can't move from one mode to another. You have got to have the headspace and the energy to be able to recognize at what point you need to be in command and control, at what point you need to be being adaptive, at what point these are tame problems. You need to build the relationships in order to be able to do this work. You need to have some honesty and integrity. And you need to make sure that you've got some personal resilience and keep your headspace to learn. This is really
absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Keith, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Good. You're welcome.
Let me just stop the recording.